pleasure and honor to be joined today with Dr. T. Colin Campbell, who has been showcasing and sharing science and research around the world that people can change their lives and their health through plants and vegetables. And there's so much research that you've been part of that's been very profound, but I'd love to start at your roots of how you grew up on a dairy farm and was the first in your family to go to university. And I believe you started studying veterinarian science. Was medicine and medical research ever in your trajectory as a young boy?
No, it wasn't.
Or young man?
Not to my knowledge at that time. I later discovered when I was working in history that my great uncle or great grand, we're not really sure yet, but for sure, the one that was my father was named after. It turns out he was a doctor in England. My father's an immigrant from Northern Ireland, and that man, it's an interesting story. He wrote about 14 books, and he actually became a vegetarian when he was 41. Spent the rest of his life doing the same thing I'm doing, and I had no idea he even existed. And I discovered that by accident working in the Oxford Library in University of Oxford.
How long ago was that?
It was
when
1985, 86.
So during the same time that you were doing the research for the China study?
I was on that track doing that research because just prior to that, I had been very active in some major organizations in this country, doing I was on the National Academy of Panel in 1980-82. And we came out with a report suggesting that we should probably eat more vegetables and fruits. It was a kind of distinguished panel. In fact, it was the most sought after report in the history of the National Academy of Sciences at the time. And I became, to some extent, sort of the face of it, because I was giving testimony before congressional committees like the Senate and House. And I was on the Neil Lair show, and I was quite out there. And so some folks got annoyed at me, and they wanted to throw me out of the university and get me to be disbarred from my society.
And this was while you were at Cornell University?
Yeah, it wasn't just Cornell in that case. In that case, it was actually people on the outside. I had a fairly senior position at the big society in the country of medical doctors. And I was the congressional liaison. It was about 80,000 physicians, I think, and others. And I was the congressional liaison for that group. That was 1978 and 79.
What were you addressing in Congress?
Well, I was testifying before committees about the report that we did in 1980-82, came out in 82. And that was on diet and cancer. And there was only 13 of us on the committee, and I was the only nutritional biochemist. And so I started saying things that questioned, the way we do things. And that upset some of my colleagues in the profession. That's part of the story. And I became, then I went to Oxford in 1985. At that time, the pushback was pretty intense, really nasty. And I was just curious, where's all this nastiness coming from? So I decided to kind of look into the history of two areas, one nutrition, the other is cancer. Look at the origin of those two sciences. And I found something amazing, and I didn't publish that at the time. I wrote quite a long paper, and then I used it. I've used it in more recent years. I dug it up and got it out. And so I've written a book now that draws from that.
And through your research while you were in England, you stumbled upon the connection to your great uncle?
Yes.
Who was also on the same track?
Yeah.
Wow.
I thought it was really eerie because I thought there was nothing before our committee in 1982. I thought we were the first. Everybody else thought so too. But when I started getting into history, first I found a book in 1937 by a guy who turned out to be the founder of the American Cancer Study, of all people, in 1913. And he was suggesting that, with this new society, they should give some serious attention to nutrition. 3 years later, he was off the board. It kind of kicked him out. And then there were others who, from time to time, would make some comment like this, and they were just totally denigrated, ignored, maybe abused. And so, the more I got into the history, I kept going back. Somebody in 1922, and then it was in 1915, and then 1908, and then kept on going back to back. In 1888, I was amazed, that there seemed to be people talking about this kind of thing, and then forgotten. I mean, it's very distinguished people at the time, like professors at the University of Edinburgh and so forth. And then back to 1865, I got that far back, I said, this is crazy. And he's the guy who wrote the physiology texts at that time that medical students were using in Great Britain. And then he referred to somebody in 1846, I think it was that. I said, wow, I read that book. I got the book out of the library, dusted it off, found out this man had written 14 books through his career. He was really quite distinguished, and he had actually been elected to the Irish Academy of Science. And then I said, who is this guy? I couldn't figure out who he is, because he was talking something along these lines that I'm now talking about. And I remembered, I looked at his name. His name was George McIlwain.
McIlwain?
McIlwain.
Oh, McIlwain.
And he was from Northern Ireland. Well, my father's an immigrant from Northern Ireland. And when I read this guy's book in 18, I thought, wow. I said, I started to say to myself, gosh darn, this is my book. This is what I wrote this darn book. I was feeling it like, there's something strange here. And so I always had remembered that we took my father back to Ireland just before he passed away in 1970. He used to tell me I should have told my grandmother she was killed in a car crash just before I was born. Her name was McIlwain. And I said, wait a minute.
So all of a sudden,
it
the
turns out
pieces are connecting together.
it was her father. Or you see, we haven't found a gravestone yet, but we've got a lot of other evidence. It was either him or his brother, but in any case, there was a McIlwain. My father's name is Thomas Colin Campbell, so he was named after his mother. And so this guy turns out to be my ancestor. And he wrote that in the 1800s.
It's pretty remarkable.
It was remarkable.
Like plant-based is really in your blood.
I went home and I told my mom at the time, she was still living, my dad had passed away at that time, when I did this in 1985. I said, I had to tell her about it. She said, this man's name is George McIlwain. I said to her, she said, don't you remember your father always talking about Uncle George? He was calling him Uncle George, but we have some evidence he was my great-grandfather.
Wow.
But he was kind of elderly when he had my grandmother. And that wasn't exactly the Victorian way to live for all kinds of reasons.
And now you're looking back at the research that he was doing.
Well, he planted a seed at that time. There were two theories of cancer. One was called the constitutional nature of disease. That means cancer is probably coming from our whole body existence and stuff like that, things like food, environment, and so forth. And it wasn't caused by a single thing, which was a popular idea. That was the alternative idea, the locus theory of disease. So we had the constitutional disease, local theory, and he was arguing for the constitutional disease, which is nutrition, that sort of stuff. And the other was that. Well, then it turned out that was middle 1800s. And he referred to somebody in the 1700s that he used to think a great deal of. His father before him was also a surgeon. And it turned out to be a spectacular story because the one who he was referring to who started this idea was in the late 1700s. He's very famous, but not for that. He's famous for he founded a hospital, it's one of the big hospitals in London now. He talked about this, and so eventually my ancestor, he wrote a book called The Memoirs of John Abernethy in 1850-some. And he was recalling where he learned this from. I'm reading this, I said, this is what my research is showing me. And all of a sudden it got me on the track of then understanding how the medical system is what it is. It got me understanding how we went down the track. We took, in the late 1800s, as a society, or in the medical area, we chose the wrong hypothesis. And then we developed a whole medical system around the wrong hypothesis.
So what is the wrong
Well, the
hypothesis
one,
that then turned into
yeah,
modern medicine and medical care?
that hypothesis was called local theory of disease. What they meant by that was, if you get cancer, for example, the surgeons believed that it was caused by something very specific, and it could be taken care of easily. Just cut it out. That's the local theory. The alternative is the whole body. There's something else going on here, or so forth and so on. So the medical system got founded in the late 1800s, and they chose the local theory of disease. That turns into be a concept I call reductionism. And that's what I wrote the book. I wrote the China study, and then I wrote the second book called Whole that came out in 2013. I didn't know at that time. Well, I knew some of that, but anyhow, my ideas about nutrition and how powerful it is radically different from almost everyone else, especially in the professions. Obviously, people like Weiss and some other physicians have now begun to embrace it too, but this whole idea is very powerful. We can do more with nutrition than all the pills and procedures combined. We can treat disease with it. We can reverse diseases.
When we're talking about, nutrition, you're saying that we can reverse disease. It's not just about the preventative measures.
That's
but
right.
We can really heal
Exactly.
somebody.
Exactly. And that's a very major point, because I think the future of this idea is not going to be dependent on arguing that we can prevent disease, because a lot of people don't necessarily pay attention to that. But when you can say we can treat disease, somebody who already has a disease, switch their diet and then watch the results. That's fantastic. And so that's what I'm writing about now, is the underlying science, because I did a lot of research. I mean, experimental research. I had lots of students, doctoral students and postdoctoral students, and sometimes visiting professors, and they would work with me, and we published a lot of stuff, and it was actual original research. And without knowing this, I was coming to that point of view just from the research. And now all of a sudden it comes together like that. It's just amazing.
What do you feel is the sort of future of plant-based? Is it now, bringing the physicians are now slowly starting to embrace the science and the research?
To some extent, individuals are, but that's another question. And why don't doctors know this? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. There's not a single medical school in the United States that teaches nutrition, not one. I just got to it not intentionally. I mean, it was exactly the opposite of what I thought too. Being raised on a farm, milking cows, and that right there is a little bit vestige of my milking days. But I was totally farm, first in the family, go to college and all that sort of stuff. And I was really into animal protein. That's really important, supposedly. And I did my doctoral dissertation on trying to show how to produce animal protein more effectively. That's where I came from, exactly the opposite. And what got me to start changing was after I left graduate school, and I spent some years, 3 years at MIT, and then I went to Virginia Tech in the Blacksburg, and that was in biochemistry. Well, there I had a fantastic opportunity. They wanted me to be the coordinator of a program in the Philippines of feeding malnourished children. So that's what I did in addition to my teaching. And in the Philippines, I was setting up a laboratory to analyze for carcinogens that might cause cancer. And on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm working, trying to help develop this program for feeding malnourished and starving children, and making sure they got enough protein.
And at that time, you were looking at, animal proteins were
that was everything.
Hopefully,
of course, that was everything. And I got this impression of some of the children and their families is not that carcinogen that supposedly causes the cancer. It's not the cause. It's the nutrition. It's the protein. And so then I came home and I got a grant from the National Institutes of Health that lasted for 27 years at one grant. They kept renewing it because I was getting this fantastic results that were hard to believe. On the one hand, from a scientific point of view, it was well accepted. But when I started talking about it in the public limelight, which I did when I was congressional liaison and stuff like that, I started saying, wait a minute here, we can't say the things we're saying. That's when they wanted to, it came out, some wanted to throw me out of my university. That's another whole story in itself, because I had tenure, and I told them, go scratch themselves. So,
So would you say you're a bit of a rebel?
yeah, I was, and that's become a story in and of itself again. There's actually I guess I can say there's this. I want to emphasize, it's already been signed and the script is almost written, but there's a movie being made of my life right now by people that you would know. Everybody know this. They're Oscar winners, and so it's a whole new dimension that I'm involved in right now. That because what I'm talking about is a way of thinking about health, a way of thinking about medicine, a way of thinking about research that has been forgotten. We ignored it. Now we have, in my view, we have a medical system that's rotten to the core. And we don't teach nutrition for starters. And so now we have the highest healthcare costs of any country in the world by far, per capita. We have environmental problems, that the chief cause of the environment is the food we eat. And it all comes down to one thing: we eat animals. It's just pretty simple. And, that's where I came from, so I know about eating animals.
When we're speaking about, conflict, how did the conflict at home work when you started speaking to your family?
Well, my father had passed by that time. I mean, he sort of knew I was getting into it, but he didn't. He had always been a farmer. He only had a couple of years of education himself, but he was gone. But my mother didn't take too kindly to it. But my brothers and our own family, we had 5 children, and that we will all worked it out. There's now 5 children, spouses, grandchildren. We got 11 grandchildren. I attribute all of that to my wife. We've been married 57 years, and so her mother had died when she was 51 of colon cancer, and that was a very tragic story then. And I didn't know at that time, what I know now, except the fact that medicine had failed her. The doctors had failed her, and then failed my dad too, because he had eventually had a heart attack. He died in 72 or 70. And so we kind of in our family, I mean, kind of seeing this kind of stuff like that.
Oh, thanks.
I was going to say we had to quit because you were there cold.
It was warm over there in the sun, and now it's getting...
So the story had a lot of personal content to it. My wife, she started listening because she had lost her mother. And we had little children at the time. And
How many?
I said we had 5 children.
Oh, okay, fine.
We had 4 boys and a girl. In any case, they're pretty much involved in this sort of stuff too. One of us now a doctor carried on my research at University of Rochester Medical Center.
When speaking about cancer and looking at cancer-causing factors, how much does nutrition and diet play into it versus environmental toxins of,
Right.
I'm not going to put my food in plastic Tupperware, right. But they're still putting their meat in the plastic Tupperware. So,
well, that's a good precaution. Not because those chemicals cause cancer. They do experimentally if you test them along. And that's usually the argument made, all these chemicals, environmental chemicals cause cancer. They're not the cause of cancer. In fact, we have almost no evidence that these environmental chemicals are related to human cancer. That was part of my story, because I started out with a chemical, and we can produce cancer with that chemical, but the cancer would only grow if we gave protein at a high level.
I grew up in California, which has a very strong legislature about trying to label and warn people about what's a cause, cancer-causing toxins. And I really grew up thinking that it was environmental things and different types of chemicals. I never heard that food could really be the impetus for it.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that either. So, but it
So
is.
how did your
It's a
research
nutrition.
begin that's unveiled this?
Well, let me clarify a couple of words here because sometimes I get confused. There's food, and then a diet is the more or less the array of foods that we tend to eat on a regular basis. So that's the word diet. It's a bunch of foods. Nutrition is the biological expression of the food. So nutrition is a concept that deals with the science. After we consume nutrients, for example, they're digested, they're massaged, they're metabolized, all that sort of thing. That's nutrition. So, and I just want to make that distinction because it does translate into the kind of foods we should eat as plant-based. But to explain it or to understand it, one has to understand the nutrition. That's the science part of it.
What are some of the leading causes or that you have found in your research? I believe
So,
like the casein protein in dairy.
well, the chief cause, and I'm confident of this by this time, the chief cause is our decision, our mental decision to eat animals. I never thought I would say that because I was on the other side of the fence. But yeah, somehow it's that concept that animals are here for us to eat, okay? And that was in ancient times almost. Eventually, when protein was discovered in 1839, they said, was this discovered meat? Oh, that's why we should eat animals. So animal-based protein became the thing to get. That's what makes a good diet, good health. And the protein it really is at the center of the debate. And what I learned in my own research and then going back in history, we chose to eat the animals. That in turn, we discovered that it had protein in it. Even the word protein. The protein comes from the Greek word, means proteos, which means of prime importance.
Of prime importance.
Yeah, so when it was discovered, the first nutrient, more or less, that was discovered, the scientists in that time, medical people in 1839, that period, they said, wow, this is the greatest thing ever. Now we know what it is, and here's sort of the chemical structure and so forth and so on. That took on a life of its own that to this day people think is important, that it's so important. We need protein.
So when we're thinking of prime importance, an animal-based protein has always been deemed like high quality.
That's right, exactly.
And so I'm wondering, like, as myself, as a plant-based vegan and others like me, are we missing out on something because we're getting ours from plants?
No, you're not. We can get all the protein we need. In fact, the ideal amount of protein we get from plants. We don't need to add animal to get protein. That's crazy.
And do they have different types of amino acids?
Yes, they do. And we're not sure exactly how that works, but I have a pretty good idea. When we make the choice of eating animal food, and then given the fact that total food consumption their total calorie consumption like a zero-sum game, when we start eating more animal food, we eat less plant food. Okay, that's why I say it's mental. It's in the choice. It's the choice, unconsciously, subconsciously. But we decide to eat animal foods, and then we put more and more in our diet. That way, we're decreasing the foods that really matter.
I guess
so it's a combiner.
I can only be so full. So if I start filling up.
That's right, exactly. And then you decrease the consumption of plant foods. So this whole nutritional idea has been misconstrued in that sense that you see diets high in animal protein, and they're associated very powerfully with heart disease, cancer, and all the rest. When you see that, it's not only because of the animal protein itself, in a biochemical sense. Mm-hmm. It's a combination of that plus all the things that are missing. Antioxidants, dietary fiber, and all that sort of stuff. So when we start looking at it that way, and we also start looking at the idea of how nutrients work together, it becomes that's the way I looked at it, and it's just extraordinarily powerful. And so when I wrote the China study, I was trying to get into some of that kind of thinking. And at that time, we were told the China study wouldn't succeed and so forth and so on. But I finally got to the end of the book, and I said, and it says near the back, forget everything I said, essentially. There's too much science here for some people. Forget what I said, just try it. It is really quite an interesting story. And I was pretty confident, it was good, of course, and because we had been doing it by that time. That wasn't the issue, but to say that in a book and be responsible and stuff like that. I didn't want to say, oh, here's all the explanation. Here's exactly how. I didn't want to say that. I want to be a little bit cautious. I said, well, just try it. In the beginning, the publisher, they tried to get me to change, and I wouldn't change. And finally, a little publisher took the book and said, okay, if you can sell 3,000 or 5,000 books, or something like that, well, he'll be happy. Later, he changed it a little bit. He said, if you can sell 13,000 books, we'll make it. Well, we've now sold 3 million.
Yeah, I was going to say.
We made the whole company and everything.
You've now sold millions of copies.
Yeah. We now hold the world record in the number of foreign translations. We've had the book translated to 48 languages.
Wow. Is it, when you say world record, is this
for health or health type books? Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. Is the China study is a very dense scientific book, and then you have millions of copies sold. It's pretty profound, because I don't think any other medical research book would connect with an average reader, not just
that's right, exactly,
not just in the medical industry or science industry.
That was my argument, actually, at a point in time when I was visiting with publishers, because they said, this book is not going to sell. You need to bring it down to a 10th grade 10-year-old, that level of reading, number one. Number two, get all those references out of it. We have about 750 references. People don't care about it. Get the references out. And the third is at least half the book should be recipes. And I had to tell them, I said, I don't even know where the pots and pans in the kitchen are. Why would I put recipes in there? And then they wanted to take out all the references, and I said, that's who I am. That's my game. I want to tell a story. So when we published,
and have it be based in truth.
Yeah, I was basing my argument not for personal reasons or ethical reasons or anything. I was just interested in the data, and that's what I saw.
And when it's so incredible that you never started out on a plant-based trajectory or agenda whatsoever.
That was as farthest from my mind as
yeah.
That wasn't it.
From a distance, it's like, what do you eat? Well, just fruits and vegetables, that's all. It's like so simple. It's like fruits and vegetables, you're just eating fruits and vegetables. But then when you actually try to break it down, and we're so detached from what a plant-based diet is traditionally that nobody even knows where to begin.